February 10th, 1990, Las Cruces, New Mexico. A pair of armed gunmen enter a bowling alley called the Las Cruces Bowl and bring everyone into the manager's office. After stealing some money from the safe, the assailants fire several bullets into 7 people before fleeing the scene. 3 of the victims, 33-year-old Ida Holguin, 34-year-old Stephanie Senac, and her 12-year-old daughter, Melissia Repass, managed to survive. But the 4 others, 13-year-old Amy Hauser, 26-year-old Steven Teran, his 6-year-old stepdaughter, Paula Holguin, and his 2-year-old daughter, Valerie Teran, are pronounced dead. While the crime generates a lot of publicity, the 2 perpetrators are never caught and their true motive for the murders remains up for debate. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to explore a pretty infamous cold case, the Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre. That voice you just heard narrating our intro was Rob Polanco, the winner of our most recent Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, so thank you very much, Rob. This is a recurring monthly contest which we've been carrying on for the past 2 years, and if you'd like to enter and haven't already done so, I will be providing instructions at the end of this episode. Rob requested that I cover this case when he originally entered the contest, and this will be one of the most harrowing and senseless crimes ever featured on the podcast. It involves a massacre which took place at a bowling alley in which 7 people, 4 of them children, were shot by 2 men during an apparent robbery. 4 of the victims were killed, and one of the survivors wound up dying of complications from her injuries 9 years later. This case was a pretty big deal when it happened, as I remember seeing it covered on a number of true crime shows, including Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted, and the composite sketches of the 2 unidentified perpetrators were shown everywhere. The story was also the subject of a documentary titled A Nightmare in Las Cruces, which raised a lot of questions about the exact motive for this crime. The total takeaway from the robbery was only a few $1,000s, but the gunmen left some money behind and appeared to be searching for something else. Given that they had no hesitation about firing bullets into every single person there, including the children, you have to wonder if there's more to this story. We are rapidly approaching the 30th anniversary of this crime, and investigators seem no closer to catching or identifying the perpetrators, so I thought it would be a good time to cover this on the podcast. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now start exploring the Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre. Our story begins in 1990 in Las Cruces, New Mexico, a town which is located 45 miles north of the Mexican border and had a population of around 57,000 people at this time. Our crime takes place at a local bowling alley known as the Las Cruces Bowl, located at 1201 East Amador Avenue. The current owner is a man named Ron Senac, who built it 6 years earlier, and his 34-year-old daughter, Stephanie Senac, is the daytime manager. On the morning of Saturday, February the 10th, The alley was not scheduled to open for business until 9 a.m., but a number of people were already there 1 hour beforehand, including Stephanie Senac, who was adding up the previous night's receipts in her office. Stephanie was joined by her 12-year-old daughter, Melissia Repass, and Melissa's 13-year-old friend, Amy Hauser, who were planning to supervise the alley's daycare that day. The alley's 33-year-old snack bar cook, Ida Holguin, a mother of 4 who had been employed there for 6 years, was also working inside the kitchen. However, at around 8:20 a.m., Melissa and Amy were about to get food from the vending machine when they were surprised to discover that 2 armed gunmen carrying .22 caliber pistols had come in through the unlocked front doors. They would both be described as Hispanic males, one of whom sported a mustache and appeared to be in his late 20s or early 30s, and spoke perfect English with no detectable accent. The other man looked like he was in his late 40s or early 50s, and spoke English with a slight Spanish accent. While the older man led the 2 girls into Stephanie's office, the young man rounded up Ida from the kitchen and brought her into the office as well. After the men ordered Stephanie to open up the safe, the 4 females were forced to lie down on the floor with their heads down, while the younger man proceeded to take the money out of the safe and place it inside a briefcase. But it wasn't long before everyone was surprised by the unexpected appearance of 3 other people inside the office. One of them was 26-year-old Steven Teran, who worked as the alley's mechanic, and he was accompanied by his 2-year-old daughter, Valerie Teran, and his 6-year-old stepdaughter, Paula Holguin. Paula was of no relation to Ida Holguin, but her biological father just happened to be Stephanie Senac's current boyfriend. Steven had gotten married to Paula's mother, Audrey, on New Year's Eve in 1986, before they eventually had Valerie together. Steven also worked as a commander-in-chief for the Army National Guard, and had recently graduated from New Mexico State University with a Bachelor of Sciences in Criminal Justice. Weeks earlier, he gave his notice to Las Cruces Bowl and only had 3 days left to work there, as he was planning to take the entrance exam for the Las Cruces Police Department the following month. On this particular morning, Audrey was taking a class at cosmetology school, and Steven was unable to find a babysitter for Paula and Valerie, so he brought them both to the alley in order to leave them at the daycare. When Steven entered the building with his 2 girls, he immediately took them to Stephanie's office, completely unaware that a crime was taking place. When he walked inside, the gunman immediately forced Steven, Paula, and Valerie onto the floor with the others. Once they finished what they were doing, the 2 men proceeded to fire over 25 bullets into the heads of all 7 of the victims, execution style. They then made an attempt to set fire to the office by lighting up some papers on the desk before fleeing the scene. Well, incredibly, in spite of being shot 5 times, Melissa was still alive, as she had wrapped her arms around her head to protect herself, and one of the bullets smashed 2 of her fingers. Melissa managed to make it to the office phone and called 911 at 8:29 a.m. It wasn't long before emergency services arrived at the scene, put out the fire in the office, and provided medical attention for the 7 victims. Remarkably, not only had Melissa survived her wounds, but her mother Stephanie and Ida Holguin were also still alive, so they were immediately rushed to the hospital and managed to pull through. But tragically, Amy Hauser, Steven Teran, and Paula Holguin were all pronounced dead at the scene, and even though Valerie Teran was taken to the hospital, she died about 45 minutes later. When Audrey Teran learned about what happened and rushed to the scene, she was informed that her husband and both of her daughters had been shot. Unfortunately, since the fire department were forced to douse the flames inside Stephanie's office when they first arrived at the scene, they may have destroyed potential evidence. While the 2 gunmen did not wear gloves when they committed the crime, the building was a public bowling alley which was frequented by many people, so it was difficult to determine if any fingerprints found at the scene belonged to the perpetrators. Oddly, even though they took between $4,000 and $5,000 in cash from the safe, they still left an undisclosed amount of money behind, and the surviving victims would later state that the gunmen appeared to have been searching for something else inside the office cabinets before they even opened the safe. Since there were survivors, they were able to provide detailed descriptions of their attackers, but it turned out there were other witnesses who had seen them that morning, including Stephanie Senac's brother, Steve Senac. Steve was on his way to school that morning, but stopped by the bowling alley because he had left his backpack in the office the night before. When he first entered the building, Steve was surprised that Stephanie had left the front doors unlocked and mentioned this to her when he grabbed his backpack. When Steve left at around 8:15 a.m., he claimed he saw two Hispanic men walking from the back of the building towards the front, and that the older man handed his partner a small briefcase. It was apparent that these men committed the crime only minutes after Steve drove away, and other witnesses would report seeing two men matching their descriptions running across Amador Avenue that morning. By 2:30 p.m., law enforcement had set up roadblocks to check all motorists who were driving out of Las Cruces. At one point, they pulled over a vehicle containing 4 individuals who were carrying $1,200 in cash. Steve was brought to the scene and asked to identify them, but said that none of these individuals were the men he had seen outside Las Cruces Bowl. In spite of these roadblocks, police were unable to find the two perpetrators, and composite sketches were eventually circulated by the media. The community was left absolutely devastated by the crime, and when the Teran family was laid to rest at their funeral a few days later, the bishop presiding over the service stated, quote, "This was not an act of God, it was an act of evil, evil men," end quote. The case received nationwide attention when it was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, which aired on April the 25th, just 2.5 months after the crime took place, and it wound up generating around 300 phone calls from viewers. America's Most Wanted also featured the story, and would continually produce new segments about the crime multiple times over the years. Even though Las Cruces Bowl owner Ron Senac actually lived inside his establishment, he had been away on a weekend golfing trip to Tucson, Arizona on the day of the murders. In spite of the fact that members of his own family were shot, Ron surprised everyone by reopening the bowling alley for business only 1 week after the crime took place. He stated, quote, "Life is for living. We're determined not to allow this insane act of 2 individuals to permanently alter the lifestyle of the community," end quote. However, later that year, Ron would run into financial problems, and Las Cruces Bowl was sold in a court-ordered auction and renamed Sun Lanes. Ron would soon move away from the area, claiming that the police had often treated him like a suspect whenever they interrogated him. Indeed, rumors always circulated that Ron spent money foolishly, was often out of town, and may have been involved in shady business deals with shady characters. However, he was thoroughly investigated by law enforcement, who were unable to find any evidence that he had knowledge or involvement in the crime, or that he was engaged in illegal activity. Suspicion would also be directed toward Ron's youngest son, RJ Senac, who worked as a bartender at Las Cruces Bowl, but was not present on the day of the crime. There were rumors that RJ had a cocaine addiction and performed drug transactions at the bowling alley, and the investigators would describe him as being very distant when he was questioned. But they also failed to turn up any evidence to suggest that RJ was linked to the murders, and he would die of an alleged drug overdose in May of 1997. As for Stephanie Senac, while she survived the shooting, she was never the same and suffered from serious post-traumatic stress disorder. Stephanie rarely ever left her home, and on one occasion in which she did venture outside to attend a parade, she heard a noise which sounded like a gunshot, causing her to freak out and start screaming. Stephanie would pass away due to complications from her injuries in August of 1999. Another potential lead was provided by a woman named Irma Tijerina, who allegedly made a comment in a bar about how she had encountered 2 men who matched the description of the shooters on the day of the crime. They wound up staying at Tijerina's residence, and at one point, one of the men heard police helicopters flying overhead and said, quote, "We're under their noses, and they don't even know it." Tijerina, who had her own history of drug usage, seemed to believe that the 2 men had gone to Las Cruces Bowl because they believed a large stash of narcotics was there, but they ultimately found nothing. Tijerina was questioned by police and passed a polygraph, but when she was later revisited by one of the detectives, she suddenly recanted her story. Tijerina wound up passing away of an accidental drug overdose in May of 2001, and her story was never substantiated. In 2010, filmmaker Charlie Min produced a feature-length documentary about the case titled A Nightmare in Las Cruces, which was released following the 20th anniversary of the crime. It contained interviews with a number of people associated with the case, including the two surviving victims, Melissia Repass and Ida Holguin. The year after the crime, Melissia was awarded the G.I. Joe Real American Hero Award for her courageous actions and received a plaque, a medal, a box full of toys, and an all-expenses-paid trip to Washington, D.C. She would eventually get married and have 2 children. Ida Holguin spent 3 months in the hospital recovering from the shooting and had to relearn simple tasks all over again. She completely forgot how to cook, and when she returned home, Ida did not even recognize her own place. Ida has been unable to work ever since, and has to take several different medications to deal with her constant headaches and PTSD. However, Ida does believe that she saw the 2 perpetrators at Las Cruces Bowl on an occasion prior to the shooting. She remembers that they never went bowling or used any of the alley services and just sat at a table watching everybody. Indeed, other witnesses have recalled seeing these 2 men at the alley at some point. Other interviewees in the documentary included Valerie Teran, who went on to have 2 more children, as well as Amy Hauser's mother, stepfather, and step-siblings. In a 2016 article about the case published in the Las Cruces Sun, Steven Teran's brother, Andy Teran, was quoted as saying, "In this day and age, things like this don't go unsolved. How did we not get these guys? That's the question I ask myself every day. Numerous people saw these gunmen, so someone out there knows something, and they need to come forward." End quote. In June of 2018, the former Las Cruces Bowl, now known as Sun Lanes, finally closed down for good, with everyone still remembering the tragedy which had taken place there. But after nearly 30 years, the 2 perpetrators have yet to be identified, and the Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre remains unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, if I could compile a list of haunting, disturbing cases which I'm shocked have still not been solved, this one would rank right near the top of the list. Like I mentioned in the intro, I still have vivid memories of watching this story get featured on episodes of Unsolved Mysteries and America's Most Wanted when I was a lot younger, and I was really bothered by the fact that these gunmen could shoot a bunch of children without hesitation. When it comes to composite sketches of unidentified suspects in cold cases, I'd say that the drawings of the 2 perpetrators of this crime are among the most memorable, and I'm sure that many true crime followers would instantly recognize the sketches from the Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre. Yet here we are nearly 30 years later, and it seems like investigators still don't have the faintest idea who these guys are. I know that a number of cases I've featured on this podcast are still unsolved because the police botch things up, but I really can't find any fault with how law enforcement have handled this investigation. It sounds like they've done the absolute best they can, and whenever you see interviews with people who worked on this case, you can tell that they put their heart and soul into trying to catch the killers, and it really bothers them that this is still unsolved. It just seems that somehow, the 2 monsters who did this managed to get lucky and slip through the cracks. Of course, there's been a lot of speculation over the idea that this crime was a lot more than a simple robbery gone wrong. There are many good reasons to believe that, which I'll get into momentarily, but I think the most chilling detail of this entire case is how Valerie Teran was shot through the forehead. That means whoever did this was looking directly at the face of a 2-year-old girl when he decided to pull the trigger, which is a special kind of evil. Even though neither of these men were wearing masks, is a 2-year-old really going to be able to provide much information to the police if you leave her alive as a witness? I mentioned earlier that this case was the subject of its own documentary, A Nightmare in Las Cruces, and I consider it to be one of the most downbeat and disturbing true crime documentaries I've ever seen. I certainly would not recommend it for squeamish viewers, as it features actual photographs and video footage of the victims' bodies at the murder scene. But on a lighter note, if any of you listeners are pro wrestling fans, You might be interested to know that the director, Charlie Min, briefly worked as an announcer for the World Wrestling Federation during the mid-1990s, but he has since gone on to direct documentaries about a number of infamous crimes, including the San Isidro McDonald's massacre and the story of wanted family annihilator Robert Fisher. Unlike most of the unsolved crimes featured on the podcast, there are still living survivors here who can share their story. So we know exactly what happened in this case, we just don't know the identities of the perpetrators or the full story behind their actions. One of the most vivid sections of A Nightmare in Las Cruces is when they play the full audio of Melissia Repass's panic 911 call in which she's trying to report what happened while dealing with the excruciating pain of gunshot wounds to the head. Judging from their interviews, it's clear that Melissia and Ida Holguin have still not gotten over the trauma of the entire ordeal, and I think that Ida in particular is plagued with survivor's guilt over the fact that she got to live while a number of children did not. Another vivid moment in the documentary is when they show live footage of the police approaching Valerie Teran in the bowling alley parking lot to inform her that her husband and daughters have been shot. Losing their entire family is one of the most devastating things a person can endure, but what makes the situation all the more tragic is the horrible luck which allowed this to happen. The only reason Steven Teran brought their two kids to the bowling alley to begin with was because he couldn't find a babysitter, and if they had arrived just a few minutes later, they would not have walked in on the crime while it was in progress. And of course another tragic element is that Steven had given his notice to the bowling alley and only had 3 days left to work there when he was killed. On the opposite side of the coin, there's Steven Senac, who stopped by there mere minutes before the crime took place and saw the likely two perpetrators hanging around outside. One detail about this crime which I've always been curious about is the fact that the bowling alley's front doors were unlocked, even though they were not scheduled to open for business for nearly another hour. It seems like Stephanie Senac just simply forgot to lock it, and Steve said he even mentioned it to her when he picked up his backpack from her office. According to Steve, he could have locked the doors himself while he was leaving, but he didn't have his keys with him. So I guess my big question is, did the two gunmen know the doors were going to be unlocked? If they saw Steve leave without locking the door behind him, then this could have made them realize that they could just walk right in. But if Stephanie had locked the doors, then what was their original plan? How would they have convinced anyone to let them inside? I have to wonder if they initially intended to enter the bowling alley after it opened for business at 9 a.m., and it was just dumb luck they found out the doors were unlocked and were able to do it earlier. Now, one aspect of the story which rarely gets mentioned is that another similar crime took place in Las Cruces less than 1 month earlier. On the morning of January the 14th, 1990, 32-year-old Salvador Lozano showed up for his job as an attendant at Ray's Shell service station and opened for business at 8 a.m. But around 2 hours later, customers walked inside to discover Salvador's body on the floor. Someone had bound his hands behind his back and fired a bullet into the back of his head before stealing $500 from the station. Sadly, Salvador's wife gave birth to a baby girl only 2 days after he was murdered. This case has not gotten nearly as much attention as the Bowling Alley Massacre, but it also remains unsolved to this day. At the time, investigators did not believe there was any connection between the two crimes, but it's hard to overlook the similarities. Both of them took place in the early morning hours, around the time the business opened, and in each case, robbery was involved, and the victim was shot in the head while they were lying on the floor. Several months later, a man named Robert McDaniel, who was arrested on forgery charges, claimed that he had been present when Salvador Lozano was killed, and that he also knew the identities of the people who committed the Bowling Alley Massacre. But much of the information McDaniel provided turned out to be false, and as far as I can tell, this lead never went anywhere. On one hand, I could see how the same person or persons who shot Lozano might be responsible for what happened at Las Cruces Bowl. It's possible that the perpetrators were planning a robbery and only expected 1 or 2 employees to be on the premises. According to the surviving victims, the gunmen seemed flustered by the fact that so many people were there, and I'm sure they must have really been taken by surprise when Steven Teran and his 2 girls came walking in. But even though they took between $4,000 and $5,000 from the safe, the fact that they still left some money behind makes me think that robbery was not the primary motive for this crime. The two men looked through some cabinets before they even opened the safe and gave off the impression that they were searching for something else and were frustrated that they could not find it. I know there has been speculation that the perpetrators were searching for a stash of drugs, which I'm sure was fueled by the rumors that the bowling alley's bartender, R.J. Senac, was heavily involved in drugs and even did transactions on the premises. Unfortunately, there is virtually no information out there about R.J. other than what was presented in the Nightmare at Las Cruces documentary. The police thought he seemed very distant when questioned about the murders, but they couldn't find any evidence to implicate him, and he died of an apparent drug overdose 7 years later. If R.J. was involved in drugs, I guess it's possible that the two men were expecting him to be at the bowling alley that morning and became frustrated when they discovered he wasn't. But if they originally went there, searching for something like a secret stash of drugs, it's surprising that they wouldn't even attempt to ask Stephanie or anyone else where it was. Of course, there's always been suspicion that the crime is somehow related to RJ's father, Ron Senac, who owned Las Cruces Bowl and was away in Arizona when this took place. Now, before I talk any more about Ron, I should preface this by stating that he was thoroughly investigated by law enforcement, and one investigator even stated that he was, quote-unquote, put under a microscope, and they couldn't find anything to suggest he was involved in the murders or any other illegal activities. But after watching Ron's interviews in Nightmare in Las Cruces, it's easy to believe that there's still something off about this guy. He surprised a lot of people by deciding to reopen the alley for business only 1 week after the crime. The way he tells it, there was a big demand for this. Ron claims that a church league bowling tournament had been scheduled at Las Cruces Bowl 2 days after the shootings, and the people involved were quite upset when they discovered it was closed. I mean, it would be one thing if Ron was just some greedy business owner who didn't want to lose money over a crime taking place at his establishment, but his own daughter and granddaughter were shot. As you know, Stephanie Senac died in 1999 due to complications from her injuries, and by all accounts, she lived the rest of her life in constant fear and rarely left her home because the men who shot her were still out there somewhere. During the documentary, some people stated that one of the hardest things for Stephanie is that the rest of her family just seemed to have a get over it, move on attitude and did not fully grasp the trauma she was experiencing. So maybe the Senacs were just a very unemotional family in general, which might explain why Ron comes across as rather cold during his interviews. But I think one of the most troubling things about Ron is that he makes a couple of statements in the documentary which are directly contradicted by the investigators. For example, Ron claims that the police told him that the shooting was a random crime, but then they cut to one of the detectives who denies ever telling Ron that, since the police had no idea if it was random or not. Ron also says that in the week following the massacre, he visited the police department every day to check on the progress of the investigation, but they claim this isn't true, and that they always had to contact Ron themselves whenever they wanted to speak with him. Perhaps Ron is just remembering things incorrectly, but I can see why people would get the impression he might be hiding something. Now here's a weird coincidence. At around 6 a.m. on March the 4th, 1991, a 55-year-old custodian named James Chapman was cleaning the Ideal Lanes bowling alley in Rio Rancho, New Mexico, when he was fatally shot in the head and shoulder in an attempted burglary. Police did not believe this crime was connected to the Las Cruces massacre, and a career criminal named Carl Percy Livernois was eventually charged and convicted of first-degree murder and aggravated burglary. Well, it turned out that before he built Las Cruces Bowl, Ron Senac had also owned Ideal Lanes, as the business license was listed under his name until 1985, before its ownership was transferred by a federal bankruptcy court to a financial institution. Again, the two separate shootings are nothing more than a coincidence, but it's interesting how Ron ran into financial problems with two separate bowling alleys within a couple years. And here's one more interesting anecdote. In July of 1992, after Las Cruces Bowl was bought out and renamed Sun Lanes, A 44-year-old civilian Otero County Sheriff's employee named Roy Nichols fatally shot his 24-year-old ex-girlfriend Vicki Dean to death in the bowling alley parking lot before turning the gun on himself in a murder-suicide. So it's pretty crazy that so many shootings seem to take place at bowling alleys in New Mexico during this time period. Anyway, back to Ron Senac. I know the police never found any evidence to incriminate him, and it's possible that he legitimately doesn't know anything, but I still wonder if the crime was the result of something he was connected to. The two gunmen who entered Las Cruces Bowl may have been expecting Ron to be there and were unaware that he had left on a weekend trip to Arizona. There has been speculation that the crime was some sort of professional hit intended to send a message to the Senac family, which is why Stephanie and Melissia were shot. This theory is supported by the fact that some witnesses, including Ida Holguin, believe they saw these two men frequenting the alley on a prior occasion, and they did not appear to be doing anything but sitting there staring at everybody as if they were casing out the place. The perpetrators also set fire to the desk in the office in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence, which is not the sort of thing you usually find if the motive for the crime was robbery. If Melissia had not been able to make her phone call to 911, it's possible the fire would have completely engulfed the office and killed everyone there, and without the accounts of the survivors, people might be looking at this case in a much different light. However, if this was a professional hit, designed to send some sort of message to Ron Senac, it was a very sloppy one. Even though they fired around 25 shots into the victims, they did not check to make sure everyone was dead, and 3 of the victims wound up surviving. Also, if this was some sort of hit against the Senac family, it's surprising they would have let Steve Senac leave before they went inside, as murdering the owner's son definitely would fit a revenge scheme. While I believe the gunmen were always planning to murder everyone, no matter what, I think the sloppiness of this crime is due largely to the fact that they had to deal with a lot more people than they were expecting, and were caught completely off guard when Steven Teran and his 2 daughters came walking into the office. Whatever the case, I still believe the main reason for committing this crime is because they wanted something else from that bowling alley besides the money inside the safe. Otherwise, I see no reason why they would have left some of the money behind. I think there is still definitely a big piece of the puzzle missing here. There's been some confusion about whether or not the 2 gunmen brought a vehicle to the scene. I've read some early newspaper articles about this case, which state that the perpetrators may have been driving a green 4-wheel drive vehicle, possibly a van. But this detail is not mentioned in Nightmare in Las Cruces, or most of the accounts of this case published during the past several years, so I'm not sure how legitimate this information is. There are apparently eyewitness accounts of 2 men running across Amador Street, and as far as I know, Steve Senac did not report seeing any additional vehicles parked near the alley when he was there. I would be really curious to know if the perpetrators had access to a vehicle that morning, which would have allowed them to flee Las Cruces. I know investigators spoke to a woman named Irma Tiarina, who claimed that she harbored 2 men at her place following the shooting, and that they were right under the police's noses while they were searching for them. But even though she passed a polygraph test, Tiarina later recanted her story and died of a drug overdose, and this lead hit a dead end. Much like the drug angle with R.J. Senac, the sole source of the Irma Tiarina story is Nightmare in Las Cruces, so I don't have any additional information about her. Truthfully, unless they had no access to transportation, it would really surprise me if the gunmen remained in Las Cruces following the shooting. They had to know that a crime in which 7 people, 4 of them children, were shot was going to bring about a ton of heat, the likes of which the area had never seen before. I know the police set up roadblocks to check everyone who was leaving town, but this did not take place until around 2:30 or so the perpetrators already had a 6-hour head start. Las Cruces is only 45 miles from the Mexican border, so they would have had more than enough time to flee the country before the manhunt started. For all we know, both these men may have spent the last 30 years living in Mexico and never returned to the U.S. This would explain why law enforcement has had no success at tracking them down or identifying them these past 3 decades, even though the composite sketches of their faces have been plastered everywhere. And that is a pretty horrifying thought. If these men were capable of firing a bullet into the head of a 2-year-old girl, then they certainly would have been capable of committing other horrific crimes, so who knows what else they may have done. After all this time, we can't even be 100% certain that the perpetrators are still alive, especially since one of them was described as being in his late 40s, early 50s. But the good news is that this story has continually remained in the spotlight since 1990, as it seems like everyone associated with this case has been relentless in their attempts to get it solved and bring the perpetrators to justice. I'm sure they will not give up, and hopefully, we will see closure someday. There is currently a $25,000 reward for information, so if you happen to know anything about the Las Cruces Bowling Alley Massacre, please contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-TIPS. That's 1-800-222-8477. Once again, a special thanks to Rob Polanco for doing such a tremendous job at narrating our opening. We've been doing this contest for 2 years now, and if you've already entered it before, you are still automatically eligible for all of our random monthly drawings, so you don't have to do anything else. But if you'd like to enter the contest, but haven't already done so, please send an email with the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, listing the one unsolved cold case you would most like to see featured on this podcast. Once again, send me an email under the subject line, Trail Went Cold Contest, to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and we've got another new bonus episode lined up for this month. And for our patrons in tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I just want to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up to support us on Patreon this week, and they are Ash M, Torsten V, Mike W, and Jackie J. Thank you all so much for your support. And I'd also like to send a special message to the girlfriend of one of our listeners who recently celebrated a special day. So on behalf of Ben, happy birthday, Sean. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.